Hi, I'm Matt Bateman. I'm the VP of Pedagogy at Higher Ground Education, and I am going to talk about work, the notion of work in education, and the history of the notion of work in education, which is a strange history. If you think about where we are today, you see this swinging between people insisting that what's important is studying the liberal arts and this and that it's important to become a good citizen and that it's important to have a good cultural education and a common ground with humanity on the one hand, and on the other hand you see people saying should be practical, it should be vocational, we should be training more doctors and computer scientists and engineers. um, and I want to explore how we got to this point. And I'm particularly interested in looking at Montessori's conception of work as a way to reconcile this history. So that's where I'm going. But our story really starts at the beginning of modern Western education. Um, so about 2,500 years ago, 600 or so BC to 400, 300 or so BC. So quite some time ago today in the Mediterranean, in ancient Greece, something resembling this debate started to emerge. Um, and there were a lot of elements to this. If you look at ancient Greece, like a lot of ancient civilizations, there were quite a number of different disparate things that were analogous to education, including a system of tutelage where parents would hire a tutor for their boy to teach them the kind of ways of the world. This was a strange system in ancient Greece, and that doesn't really concern us here. The more common one that does concern us is a fairly standard and quite ancient system of apprenticeship, particularly familial apprenticeship. That is, if you're a boy, you learn a trade from your father. If your father was a blacksmith, he taught you to be a blacksmith. And this doesn't have to be super rigid. There are ways to learn a profession outside of your family, but that's the norm. If you're born into a blacksmith family, you become a blacksmith. If you're born into an agricultural family, you go and work in agriculture and for finance and being a merchant and so on and so forth. Um, and if your father taught you if your father taught you his trade, by Solon's law, you were legally obligated to provide for him in old age. So this was both a strong cultural norm. This was both kind of what happened, but there were also legal systems that enforced this. So this is apprenticeship. It's tutoring. It's very one-on-one. It's very familial, and it's probably I don't even know if you would want to raise it to the level of calling it education. It's not like systematic instruction with a curriculum, but it was learning. It was learning and learning something valuable, learning a trade that happened by some sort of process of fairly formal, maybe informal instruction, but informal instruction that was codified into the culture and that happened really regularly. So this is you learn a trade, you learn your family's trade. So that's the status quo, and this certainly existed in ancient Greece. And this existed at the same time as another kind of education started to emerge and become more and more prominent, something that we would think of as cultural education. This is an education that increasingly had a curriculum attached to it. So everyone in ancient Greece of a certain standing learned Homer's works and Hesiod's works, the Iliad, the Odyssey, comparable works of standing. These were, it's basically impossible to understate their prominence. These epic works of poetry and these works of religious poetry were the universal textbook and reader of the age. They were like the Bible in the Middle Ages and Webster's dictionary in the modern age, all kind of rolled into one thing. I mean, they were passed on largely orally, so you would learn these works, you would memorize portions of them. It was a literature education, a grammatical education. If you were learning to read and write, it was an education in literacy as well. And this tied together with music, which was very closely connected to literature for the ancient Greeks. And their education also included a great deal of physical education, which became more systematized and formalized, and people started to have more and more opinions about how it should look and how it should go. And at the kind of avant-garde edge, it also started to include mathematics. So you had literature and music, this musical education, which were one and the same, gymnastics, this physical education, and mathematics. that started to really emerge as the core of ancient Greek education, something that resembled the liberal arts. And I have this quote here. All of my slides are quotes from history, from Aristotle, that I think is really interesting if you're interested in issues of the philosophy of education. So this is from the last chapter of the Politics. So this is Aristotle just trying to understand what are the questions in education that face us as a society. He writes, what constitutes education and what is the proper way to be educated? At present, there are differences of opinion as to the proper tasks to be set. For all peoples do not agree as to the things that the young ought to learn, either with a view to virtue or with a view to the best life. Nor is it clear whether their studies should be regulated more with regards to intellect or regards to character. And confusing questions arise out of the education that actually prevails, and it is not at all clear whether the pupil should practice pursuits that are practically useful or morally edifying or higher accomplishments. For all these views have won the support of some judges, and to add to that, people don't even agree what counts as virtue. So people disagree about the nature of the good life and virtue. So even if you think that education should be about virtue, well, what is virtue? It just raises further questions. I mean, this passage is really remarkable in that the questions that it raises are really perennial. What is education about? Is it about what's practical? Is it about creating a certain kind of moral character? Is it about teaching higher accomplishments? What Aristotle was probably referring to here is things like culture and mathematics and certain issues of theory and philosophy. What is really the most important thing in education? And in ancient Greece, as these things were emerging and becoming part of educational practice, these were live questions, and these are questions that still live with us today. And part of the reason why these questions are coming up for Aristotle is that when you start to get something like a liberal arts education, immediately the question comes up as to what the point of it is. Why learn higher mathematics? And this is in a fairly technologically primitive society. So it's not like the reason to learn higher mathematics was that it would make you really good at computer science or engineering. Higher mathematics really wasn't that useful, particularly the kinds of geometry and mathematical proofs and explorations that really interested people. And even Homer. So take a literature education. What does it teach you? So his epics are very long works. They're very expansive, and you can find passages in them about everything, really everything, from cooking to medicine to warcraft to statesmanship. But it's not real practical guidance. It can hardly be said to amount to real practical guidance. Some people argued that it was, but they became increasingly ridiculed. And so the answer that emerged, and you can see this in the Aristotle passage, was really, this is about virtue. The point of all this literary, musical, physical education is to make you into a certain kind of person with a certain kind of character, an excellent, well-balanced person. And that's even true of mathematics. Mathematics trains the mind. It trains a certain kind of intellectual virtue. And I mean, this argument should sound familiar. Internalizing cultural achievements, learning them in a certain way makes you a good person, a better thinker with better judgment. It makes you more temperate and more wise. And even if you're skeptical of this at the time in ancient Greece, if you're skeptical that education can really do this, if you're skeptical that education is good, you're skeptical, this is what you're skeptical about. You're skeptical that all of this book learning and book smarts and curriculum that's emerging is actually going to make you good. And there's this really amazing passage from Theognis. This is before Aristotle by a couple hundred years. It is easier to get and raise a child than to put character in him. No one has ever found a way to make a fool wise or a bad man good. If God had given the sons of Asclepius, so this was the medical profession, if God had given doctors this power, how many and large would be the fees that they earn? And if you're an educator and you think that what you do does help people become wise and good and virtuous, this should really give this, I mean, this argument should still give you pause. Do we really do this? Is studying Homer really the route to doing this? Does math really help you become a good person? And if not, why learn it? What is the practical value of these things? This has always been the debate. So how does all of this relate to, remember we started with, there's this kind of ancient system of you learn a trade in your family. You learn how to be a blacksmith or how to be a farmer or how to be a merchant or a financier, or you learn statesmanship if you're the son, if you're in the aristocracy, you're part of the political class. There's things that you learn as part of growing up in an apprenticeship model. So how do these two things connect up? This emerging liberal arts classical, what we would now call a classical education, what to them was a very contemporary education, with more vocational education. Unfortunately, the answer is that they were really seen as separate issues, as kind of separate things. So I'm going to pull up a passage here from Aristotle's Politics, one of the most unfortunate passages in Aristotle, where he lays out in a kind of almost casual way his views on this. Yes, you should teach children useful things that are really necessary. But it is evident that they should not be taught, children should not be taught all things that are useful, since there is a difference between the tasks of the free and those of the unfree. So he's talking here about citizens, free citizens on the one hand, and slaves or servants on the other hand. And the children of the free should share only in such useful things as it will not turn them into vulgar craftsmen. Any task, craft, or branch of learning should be considered vulgar if it renders the body or mind of free people useless for practices and activities of virtue. That is why the crafts that put the body in a worse condition, so imagine being a farmer or a blacksmith, and work done for wages, so work done to earn money, are called vulgar, for they debase the mind and they deprive it of leisure. So there's this worry that, what is Aristotle on about? There's a worry that if the purpose of the liberal arts education, this kind of emerging cultural education, is to make you good, make you a certain kind of well-balanced person, that's opposed and antithetical to it being too practical. Because being too practical, being concerned with wages and money and a certain kind of concern that's not fitting, he thought, of a decent citizen and a free person. These views seem quite anachronistic now, and quite backwards, but these were the views at the time. That's going to make you into a bad person. That's precisely going to make you into a bad person. You want to be above the fray. You want to be above that. And a certain over-focus on the practical is inimical to having a good character. It's a real mind-body split, and you see it in Aristotle as well as Plato. You see it all over the place. And this is this separation between vocational value and cultural or characterological value, liberal arts value in education, it turns out to be very, very sticky for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. I mean, barely thousands of years, multiple thousands of years, 2,000 years, but many, many hundreds of years. So this distinction, this notion of a liberal arts education that's for character and that's not practical, it morphs in content. So, the Greeks had music and gymnastics and mathematics, and in medieval times, for example, it becomes the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, astronomy, music, and the two branches of mathematics, arithmetic, and geometry. But so the form, the actual specifics change. You don't study Homer anymore, but it's largely, and you're not physical education anymore, but it's still the same idea. It's a largely detached intellectual, in this case, theological pursuit. Maybe not leisure exactly as Aristotle conceived it, but certainly analogous. It's different from the trades. It's separate from the trades. It serves a different function from the trades. And if you mixed it with the trades, that would ruin the point. Being involved in the trades debases your character, the argument goes. And learning all this cool intellectual, cerebral stuff, religious things, spiritual things, those are what really elevate your character. And so you see this through the medieval period, but you see this persist in a certain form very late into the Enlightenment, even way into the Industrial Revolution. Education has this character. I mean, you can see it today to some extent, which we'll get to. And this is particularly true in the US. Europe was a little bit faster by 50 or 100 years in changing this, but not that much. And that's strange. It's strange that the intellectual and vocational are seen as separate. So why is it strange? one of the presuppositions of the Enlightenment and the modern world that's really new and different, certainly different from ancient Greece and antiquity, is this belief in the practical power of knowledge. Knowledge is power. So Francis Bacon coins this idea that knowledge is power. And I mean, Francis Bacon, who lived in a time that was, I mean, it was he lived in the scientific revolution, but it was before the fruits of the scientific revolution. So he lived before Newton. So he didn't even know what was coming in terms of science and technology and industry. He thought that we would become so scientifically advanced that we would live forever in robot bodies that we fashioned for ourselves once we got smart enough to invent them. And the Industrial Revolution really bears that out, not literally that we live forever in robot bodies, but that kind of massive increase in wealth and quality of living that's really fueled by intellectual advances. It's really fueled by knowledge, the sciences, the very cultural things that were once thought to be very ivory tower turn out to be very practical. And you would think that education would naturally become more specialized, and it started to, but again, on the whole, it didn't. So why didn't it? What was happening? I have here a passage, or not a passage, a Harvard entrance exam from 1869. So this is right smack dab in the middle of the 19th century and well into the Industrial Revolution. And what do you think Harvard, the preeminent university in America, what do you think was on their entrance exam? Just form a guess in your mind. So this is what was actually on the exam. It was all Latin grammar. All Latin grammar. Decline in the singular, facie idem. I can't even read it over the stamp. Filius portus dia navis. Decline those in the plural. Write gender over the nouns. Give the significance of terminations. Give the principal parts of cato, tono. So this is a Latin exam. It's very, very classical in character. And the George Eliot, the great reformer of Harvard, really lamented this at this time. And he describes the system of education that really persisted in America. Only a few years ago, all students who graduated at this college passed through one uniform curriculum. This is Harvard. And Harvard was really a theological school. It was very, very classical and theological. The system is still the prevailing system amongst American colleges and finds vigorous defenders. It has the merit of simplicity. So had the school methods of our grandfathers. One primer, one catechism, one rod for all children. Again, one uniform curriculum, a cultural curriculum that everybody learns these basic foundations, these timeless basic foundations. On the whole, a single common course of studies, tolerably well selected to meet average needs, seems to most Americans a very proper and natural thing, even for grown men. So this is even at the college level. The idea of electives. This was one of George Eliot's innovations, was he brought electives to Harvard. You could choose what classes you wanted to take and what course of study you wanted to take, a very radical idea in the mid-19th century. This is a very, very recent idea. As a people, we do not apply to mental activities the principle of division of labor, and we have but halting faith in special training for high professional employments. What's happened is that classical education has really metastasized as the dominant kind of assumed received form of education. This is what we've done for hundreds of years. If you want to become an educated person, you learn the classics from antiquity, you learn religion, you learn these highfalutin topics with no practical value, and that's separate from learning a vocation. And in a good case, in the kind of best case, so America's founders, people like Benjamin Franklin, held work and labor and vocation in very high esteem. So what did they say about this kind of separation of vocational training and learning and classical training? They didn't have a solution. They said that you should just have both side by side. So you should go to school and learn the classics and learn mathematics and learn these useless topics to become a good person, to change your character into one of an educated person. But don't spend too much time on it. You should also leave enough time to go and like get an apprenticeship at your local newspaper, or clerk at a lawyer's office, or work in the fields, or work with your hands, or build something. So you also had to have a labor component, but that wasn't education. That was considered separate from education. And that's interesting and strange. It's interesting and strange that education would continue to have this very detached, otherworldly ivory tower character. and that even through the Industrial Revolution and the rest of the Enlightenment, where it seems like, no, there's more to be said here about the practical value of knowledge. And there's more to be said here about the role of work in life and the role of productivity in life. Really, Maria Montessori is the thinker who addresses this topic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She is starting to notice, she's starting to make her observations that children are capable of incredibly intense, concentrated work, the kind of work that you associate with genius, like Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel, and you have to pry him away from his work because he's in this incredible flow state. She thought that children could do this, and everybody thinks of children as these inattentive, their attention is fleeting and they're very distractible, but she thought that under the right conditions, you could get children really engaged in focused work, purposeful work with their hands that was intellectual and creative and took a lot of effort on the part of the child. And that the child at work was, and this was her kind of educational innovation here, was a character builder. It was a character builder. So here's an illustrative passage from Montessori. The little child who manifests perseverance in his work as the first constructive act of his psychical life, and upon this act builds up internal order and equilibrium and the growth of personality, demonstrates almost as in splendid revelation the true manner in which man renders himself valuable to the community. The little child who persists in his exercises, concentrated and absorbed, is obviously elaborating the constant man, the man of character, the man who will find in himself all human values, crowning that unique fundamental manifestation, persistence in work. This is new, this idea. And it's a real departure from the idea that the way to become a good person and have good judgment is to study literature and mathematics. I mean, Montessori's view is, it has consonance with certain religious views, certain kind of views that have had sway in the West periodically about the role of work in creating a certain kind of interdiscipline. But her elaboration of it here, it's a distinctly Enlightenment, almost American view of work is the source of all virtue. It's not the thing that Aristotle was so worried about, being concerned with wages and being too servile and practical. Montessori's view is, no, this is actually the font of morality and virtue, and education should reflect that. Education should reflect that. It shouldn't just be that you learn certain things in school and then you go off and get a job and that's where the real moral education starts. No, educators precisely are charged with thinking about moral development, and if moral development happens through work, then we need to think about that. So here's two more passages from Montessori. The one on the left is from Child, Society, and the World, and it's the story that she tells about this boy in America, the son of a millionaire who ran away and was eventually found working in a jazz band. Previously, he had lived in marvelous conditions. He lived in a mansion with cars and money, but now he was poor. He earned $8 a week. Why? Because he had acquired and felt the value of his own personality. Did he continue in the jazz band? No, but in this phase of life, this teenager, he needed the experience of being productive on a social and experimental basis. This is only one example. It must be realized that at this stage, the child must continue his cultural development by living the experiences of whatever aspect of a society attracts him through the methods of production, work, and experiment. So this is the rich who don't need to work. She says it's the opposite of what Aristotle says. Aristotle says, look, thank God you're a member of the aristocracy and you're getting educated and you don't have to concern yourself with too many practical things. Her view is, no, like you gotta go and work with your hands and figure it out and figure out how to be creative and produce in a real way. Even young children need something like this. So here's a passage from the end of From Childhood to Adolescence on the right. The children of 3 years of age in the children's house learn to carry out work as chores. She goes on to elaborate: dusting, washing dishes, etc. Washing themselves, combing their hair. These exercises are part of the method of education and do not depend on the social position of the pupils, even in the children's houses attended by rich children who are given every kind of assistance at home and who are accustomed to being surrounded by a crowd of servants. These children take part in the exercises of practical life. This has an educational and not a utilitarian purpose. This idea that vocational work, practical work, has characterological value, again, it's new. It's a departure from the model where what has characterological value is something more detached, something more cultural, something more spiritual, something more like higher mathematics, something more cerebral or intellectual. And what really, I mean, this is one of Montessori's major innovations, is figuring out how to bake work into education without compromising the fact that there is something about learning mathematics that's also good for the mind. So it's not either or, but there's a missing element. There's a missing element, and Montessori is the one to really focus on this. Otherwise, other thinkers, it's still separate at this point. Vocational training is still separate from cultural training and characterological training. How you become good is not by working. So what happens? What happens here? And how do we get to where we are today? What happens is that Montessori doesn't take. So there's this burst of interest in Montessori in the US in the 1910s. It flames out very, very quickly. And at the time, at least in the US, when education is really modernizing between 1900 and 1950, this is the peak influence of progressive education, which is very, very different from Montessori. Has some similarities, but it's very different. And they have some rhetoric, the kind of Deweyan school, progressive school, around the practical value of education. But really, as it morphs and shifts, the progressive school of thought ends up abdicating on this issue in favor of more social, emotional themes of finding yourself, expressing yourself, following your interests, staying motivated, learning to learn, nurturing your curiosity. It's not so much about practical value. And so as society modernizes, and specializes, which it unquestionably does, I mean, it becomes much, much, much more modern and specialized. There's no debate today that education should be specialized, that people should be specialized. There's still a debate as to whether or not education should be specialized. Education still has these classical vestiges. You still get hand-wringing about things like this. So this is I pulled this from Brian Kaplan's book, The Case Against Education. This is research from Snyder and Dillow. The things that are really useful in today's modern economy, like basic math and basic literacy skills, so they can see that those have some practical value in today's modern economy. You really don't spend most of your time on that in high school. Most of your time is spent on low useful things and medium useful things. Really, most of your time is spent on useless things like arts and foreign languages. Why do we learn those? I mean, you see this debate come up every time somebody questions the value of the humanities and higher education. Why are so many people getting degrees in such useless subjects like history and philosophy and such purportedly useless subjects? It's still not something that we've worked out as a society, the relationship between classical and vocational learning. And you still hear the same kind of arguments that Aristotle and Plato gave for this kind of education. Yeah, the point isn't the practical value. The point is that it makes you into a certain kind of person. So how do you get the practical value? Is that the role of education? No, you get those skills on the job. And so education still hasn't really integrated this insight from Maria Montessori, that work is a thing that has this deeper characterological value and really drives home a lot of these virtues that are supposedly more intellectual. So the issue remains unresolved. The issue remains unresolved. You still see the same debate about more vocational education versus more liberal arts, more characterological, more virtue-oriented, or more citizenship-oriented education. And this problem still needs to be solved. I think Maria Montessori solves it, but I mean, more needs to be said about how it solves it and why, and what the relationship is to her conception of work, which is really more characterological and less vocational, to vocational training. So that's all I had to say for today. The takeaways here, I have a few, are one, education has almost always been split between the vocational and the practical, the characterological and the intellectual. This is the norm. This is the norm. This is an ancient problem. Classical education has always eschewed the practical, and progressive education really never successfully valorized it. And among Montessori's most novel contributions to educational theory is her recognition of the inextricable link between these two elements, her recognition that the hand and the mind go together. One footnote here before I depart. So this is a presentation for a truly global conference. And so just let me say by way of apology that I don't intend these lessons to generalize necessarily. The solution surely generalize. I think that Montessori has the right solution, even though I only indicated it in passing, to how to think about work and more cultural elements in education and how they integrate and add up to a life of virtue. But whether or not this particular historical pattern, where there's these two strands of education that are divided, whether that repeats is something that I would love to know and make no claims about here. If you have some insight to add about that, definitely feel free to reach out to me, and I will read anything that you recommend. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.